where are you going to get that living water? She seems to be saying, yeah, I know there's living water down there if you go deep enough, but you don't even have no bucket and no rope, and this, that's a long way down. How are you going to retrieve that water that you're promising me? And he answered, or she didn't let him answer yet. She asked a question, but she continued. She said, are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and drank from it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock? So she's asking him whether he claims to be greater than Jacob. This well has Jacob's name and reputation attached to it. He is the patriarch of all Jews and Samaritans. All 12 tribes of Israel were from his 12 sons. And therefore he is one of the greatest men in the memories of the Jews and of the Gentiles, if the Gentiles were Samaritan Gentiles. And so she says, you're kind of diminishing the value of this water here. You want me to give water that I have, but I don't claim my water is living water. It's just from this Jacob's well is all. What, you think Jacob's well isn't good enough? It was good enough for Jacob. He drank from it. His family drank from it. You think you're better than that? You have better water? You have a better well than Jacob's? She's kind of offended by the suggestion that he can get water that she can't get from Jacob's well, as if maybe the water is in a different well, because this one's too deep for him without a bucket and a rope to get the living water out of it. And Jesus answered and said to her, whoever drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water, springing up into everlasting life. Now, it seems clear that Jesus is here talking about something supernatural, though it seems that she doesn't quite get that it's not water. It sounds like he's talking about magic water, water that isn't like ordinary water. Because this water, although it's from Jacob, and even though, that's prestigious and all, it still never will satisfy or quench your thirst eternally. No matter how often you drink from it, there'll always be a time you get thirsty again and have to come back for more. But he says, I'm talking about something you won't have to repeat. You don't have to be drinking of it constantly, but you can do that. You can't drink from this water constantly because your belly will get full. You can't just drink water all the time. You have to drink regular water occasionally. But whoever is drinking, and I believe it is implied continually, of this water that I will give, and you can do that. You'll never get your belly full and not be able to drink it anymore, but you can drink it all the time. You can tap into that spring, that fountain of water. It'll be like a fountain in you, springing up continually, so that you don't ever get thirsty again. Now, she, still understanding this more or less in the natural of regular water, said to him in verse 15, Sir, give me this water that I may not thirst, nor come here to draw. Now at this point, Jesus apparently decides that the analogy of water has got to be explained or abandoned. It was a good conversation starter when you're at a well and the person's there to gather water. Obviously they're there because they're thirsty, or they anticipate being thirsty, and they're getting water for the day. And so you can offer living water. That's kind of a bridge of evangelism from where the person's at to where you want them to be thinking. And so he's brought up this subject. I've got something I can give you. It'll bring eternal life and continual satisfaction of your thirst. But she still, at this point, is thinking in terms of natural water and natural thirst. And says, well, you got some kind of magical water that'll do it. I don't know where you're going to get that, but I'll be glad to have it. You've got to give it to me. You offered it to me, I'm asking for it. But now he's got to change the subject so that she's not still thinking about water and natural thirst. So he's got to change the direction to spiritual things, because he's talking about spiritual things. He wants to get her transitioning from the thought of water to something more like what he's really talking about. To do that, and knowing her marital background prophetically, he decides to bring that subject up, because that subject becomes a matter that sparks her spiritual thirst. In fact, it is my opinion that this woman was very much aware of a spiritual thirst in her. I'll tell you why as we read these verses. Jesus said to her, "Go call your husband and come here." Now, he knew she didn't have one. He knew what her answer would have to be. And he knew that that was a matter that would get the subject going where he wants it to go. The woman answered and said, "I have no husband." Technically true, of course. Now, he was a stranger in town, so for all she knew, he didn't know anything about her background and no reason to volunteer all that. She'd give a simple and true answer, even a little evasive. "I don't have a husband to bring." So, by implication, go ahead and tell me whatever you're going to tell me, or give me what you're going to give me, because I can't go get my husband and bring him. This is, this is as good as you're going to get it. It's me here. So I'm listening. And Jesus said to her, "You have well said, I have no husband. For you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. In that you spoke truly." And the woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet." Now notice where she goes with this. "Our fathers worshipped on this mountain," Mount Gerizim, "and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where one ought to worship." Now, how is this conversation transitioning? Where's it going? Well, I'm going to suggest something different than what I normally hear people suggest. A lot of people feel that this woman is cynical. This woman is kind of a woman of ill repute. That some of her remarks to Jesus are intended in sarcasm, and so forth. And this is because most evangelicals who read this find a woman who's been married 5 times and living with a guy, well, she must be a hussy. She must be a bad, bad woman. But that's our evangelical orientation and culture talking. In those days, she might not have been that unusual. A man could divorce his wife just by saying, "I divorce you." There's very little to it. And then she'd go and be another man's wife. If she had lived enough years and had enough fickle husbands who wanted to switch wives, she might have been taken and dumped any number of times through no fault of her own. But she's lived with a guy now. Well, maybe she learned her lesson about marriage, There's a lot of people in our culture who have given up on marriage too. They've been married multiple times, and they say, well, through no fault of their own, they were dumped by their spouse, and they say, "I'm done with marriage. Maybe I'm not done with companionship. Maybe I'm not done with sex, but I'm done with marriage." I mean, a lot of people are thinking that way who aren't Christians. And a lot of Christians sometimes think it'd be nice if we could do that, because marriage is so risky these days. Marriage is, you can just be abandoned, whereas if you're not married, you don't get all your hopes up. It's very possible that that was where she was at. Anyone who's been through 5 failed marriages, now whether she had become a widow a couple of times or so, probably not all 5 times. Almost certainly there's some divorces there. But she had tried marriage 5 times. What's amazing is she didn't give up on it earlier. A lot of people give up on it after 1 bad marriage or 2, certainly 3. But she had never given up on marriage until she'd had 5 failures. And she still hadn't given up on relationships. She just given up on marriage. It obviously wasn't anything that was working for her. So it doesn't mean that she was particularly immoral. She may have actually been unusually committed to marriage, to have married 5 times in spite of 4 earlier failures. At the 5th failure, she apparently thought, well, that's enough. That's enough marriage. And yet she needed someone to support her. I mean, women couldn't support themselves in those societies, so she had to have a man. She just had probably given up on marriage. There's no other reason we know of why she would have had 5 marriages and then not marry this guy. She's apparently become cynical about marriage, but probably not feeling very good about her present situation. Probably feeling convicted. Now, I'm going to come back and talk about that a little bit, but you see, the next thing she brings up is this theological controversy between the Samaritans and the Jews. And some people think what she's doing is, now that he's put his finger on her sin, she's wriggling uncomfortably under the conviction and wants to dodge it and change the subject into something totally irrelevant. That's what many people say. You know, suddenly she's convicted by what he said. She doesn't want to come to the light. She wants to hide in the darkness. She wants to change the subject, get off that subject that's bringing her conviction, and go somewhere totally anywhere else. Let's talk about our controversies, theologicalism here. As if she wasn't really interested in the theological controversy, she just wanted to get onto any other subject, to take the spotlight off of her. Now, that's how I always hear this preached. That's not what I think is happening, though. I don't see any reason to give her such ill motives and impute that to her. She is living in a sinful situation, and she knows it. In that time, what would a person do to remedy that? Take a sacrifice and offer it to God, a sin offering, a trespass offering, or something like that. But she's got a bit of a problem. She's not sure which place is the place that God honors. She's heard that Jews think one thing and her people think another thing. What if she took a sacrifice to the wrong place? It might not only fail to atone for her sin, it might even offend God that she's not at the right place. And she has been paralyzed, possibly, and this is my way of looking at it, she's been paralyzed by the ignorance of this topic. That this was not some arcane theological dispute that she was just trying to find any theological question to raise, since she found he was a prophet, that would get him onto another subject, get him onto one of his favorite subjects, you know, and off of her unfavorite subject. Some people kind of cast the conversation that way. I don't think so. I think where she's at is she really does have a thirst, and that's why Jesus is talking to her. Do you realize this woman is the only person on record to whom Jesus said, "I am the Messiah"? Many other people asked him directly, "Are you the Messiah?" And he'd say things like, "I've already told you and you won't listen," you know, or something like that. He'll change the subject. With her, he actually said, "I am the Messiah." He didn't even say it that clearly to his disciples. He made them say it. Then he said, "Blessed are you, flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father has." He confirmed it to them, but to just reveal it to this woman. Now, Jesus doesn't cast his pearls before swine. This woman, I believe, was a person who had an unusually spiritually hungry heart. And we can see her reaction when she gets converted. She goes out and evangelizes everyone she sees. Not everyone does that. This woman was a spiritual woman who had miserable marriage failures again and again and again, but had for the longest time not even given up on marriage. She had to have a man, so she'd marry him. Eventually she did finally lose all hope in marriage, apparently, and decide not to marry the guy. This is, of course, my reconstruction of the situation, but it fits all the facts, and to my mind, it's a more charitable way of looking at it, because if she really was just a cynical person, kind of trying to dodge the issue, not wanting to feel the conviction, why would Jesus reveal to her things he didn't reveal to anybody else? Oh, if she's not really an honest person, someone who's trying to hide in the darkness. I believe she was a very honest person. And once she found out that he knew things about her that a man could not know, I think she thought, wow, there's a prophet here. We haven't seen one of those for a long time. Now I can get my question answered, because my sins require that I make an atonement. And I really need to know where that is the right place to do that. Is it Gerizim or is it in Jerusalem? And Jesus gave her an honest answer. He didn't say, "Hey, stop dodging the question. Let's get back to the subject of your shacking up." No, she went in the direction of Mount Gerizim and worshiping God, and he took that interest seriously, and he taught her on that subject, because he, unlike in many other cases, people ask him one question, he goes off and talks about something different because he doesn't consider their question to be germane to where they're really at, or honest, or whatever. In her case, she asked a question that many people are going to try to say she wasn't really that interested, she just wanted to get off the topic. But actually, Jesus treated it as if it was an honest and genuine question, and he answered it very deeply and told her things that we have no record of him ever telling anybody else. So, I also want to point this out. She had had 5 husbands. That means Jesus recognized 5 legitimate marriages. he did not recognize the legitimacy of her present arrangement. So Jesus did know how to make a distinction between a legitimate marriage and an illegitimate shacking up. Yet, he did seem to take at face value the legitimacy of her first 5 marriages. Now, we don't know much of the history. We don't know if she had been widowed any of those times, but it seems very unlikely she would have lost 5 husbands to death. Maybe 1 or 2, maybe, but I mean, certainly with 5 marriages behind her, some of those must have been divorces. And that means that she had no doubt been divorced and remarried. And divorced and remarried, and divorced and remarried. And yet Jesus considered all of those marriages legitimate. He didn't consider her present arrangement legitimate. That was a situation that would be called fornication. But her marriages and remarriages were taken at face value as the real thing. And I say that only because while it is true that some remarriages are not legitimate, and Jesus made it very clear that under certain circumstances, divorce or marriage is adultery, he did not count it to be so in her case. He referred to her marriages not as adultery, but as marriages. And there's a world of difference between adultery and marriage. Marriage is sacred, adultery is sin. So we might find people who've been married 2 or 3 or 4 times, and every one of their marriages are adultery, because they never once had grounds for divorce. They just jumped from bed to bed and get a legal paperwork for it. The state cannot legitimize adultery. If it gives a marriage license to an adulterous relationship, that doesn't make it not adultery. That doesn't make it marriage. Marriage is sacred. Marriage is honorable. The bed is undefiled. Adultery is the opposite. And Jesus said a lot of remarriages are really adultery, not remarriage. But in this woman's case, he recognized marriage 5 times in a row, legitimate. So it may well be that in her case, her husbands were adulterers, or in some other way had legitimized her freedom to remarry. Under the law of Moses, of course, a woman could, in Deuteronomy 24, it said a woman could remarry if her husband simply gave her a writing of divorcement. It doesn't even say what grounds he would need to have. And so she'd go off and marry again. That was allowed under the law. And Jesus does not necessarily challenge that here, which tells me that in some cases Jesus does not recognize remarriage because it is adultery, but in some cases he does. And that's worth saying because there are so many different opinions among Christians on this subject, and I do from time to time get phone calls on the air and meet people who tell me no remarriage is ever legitimate, ever, no matter what the grounds for the divorce is. In fact, there was a gentleman who was coming to our meetings here last year, and that was his position. He always wanted to engage me in that conversation. And frankly, you know, I've looked into it. I disagreed with him. I didn't want to argue that with him. But the point is, there are people who will condemn all cases of divorce and remarriage, and Jesus apparently doesn't do that. He didn't condemn her 5 marriages, which must have been one after another, and some of them must have ended in divorce. Anyway, that's just a sidebar on that particular point. Now, I want to say too, in verse 14, when he says, "But the water that I shall give him," not that part, the first part, "whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst." I want to mention that because there's a number of places in John's Gospel where Jesus is quoted as saying, "Whoever does this shall never something else." For example, in John chapter 6, he says, "He that eats my flesh and drinks my blood shall, he that eats my body will never hunger." Okay? And in other places it says that my sheep hear my voice and follow me, and they shall never perish. And in the book of John, there's about 4 or 5 of those kinds of statements. That he that X's shall never Y. That's the structure of the sentence. And many people feel that means that if you do X one time, that you'll never why. And they say, well, look here, Jesus said whoever drinks of this water will never thirst. So if you have ever drunk of that water, then you'll never be lacking it anymore. In other words, you can't lose what you gained. Whoever eats of his flesh and drinks of his blood will never hunger. Well, that means you only have to do it once, they think. And then you've got it for life. And this is, of course, those who believe in unconditional eternal security. They just believe that you have to say the sinner's prayer once. You have to eat that one time. You need to drink that one time. Take one drink and you'll never thirst again. And no matter what happens, you'll never thirst. But that's not really how this kind of sentence is understood. The first verb is in a present tense, which can be taken as continuous. Whoever is drinking of the water. That is a legitimate translation. Whoever is drinking of the water that I give will never thirst. Whoever is eating my flesh and drinking my blood shall never hunger. Whoever is my sheep, hearing my voice and following me, shall never perish. Whoever is doing these things, no matter how long they do them, they'll never perish or grow hungry again. But they have to keep doing them. This is an ongoing behavior. And basically, to prove that that's what is meant, you can contrast it with the last verse of John chapter 3. The last verse of John chapter 3 says, "He who believes in the Son has everlasting life. He who does not believe," present tense, "the Son shall not see life," future tense. Essentially, if this means whoever doesn't believe one time shall never be saved, that would be disastrous, because all of us at one time did not believe. And he says, whoever does not believe shall not see life. It almost sounds like saying, well, anyone you've met who's not believe, they're never going to be saved. They're never going to see life. It's predicted. They shall not see life. But obviously he means whoever is not believing, while they are not believing, they shall not see life. Obviously that person who doesn't believe might change and believe, and then he will see life. It is, in the case of the first verb, as long as the first verb is continuing, the second statement, the second prediction, is true. As long as he is unbelieving, he will not see life. As long as one is drinking, they will not thirst. As long as one is eating, he will not hunger. As long as one is following, he shall not perish. These are the meanings of these multiple statements in John that talk this way. And so Jesus is not saying, take one drink and you're in for life, you know. He's saying, I can give you something that can continuously spring up in you like a fountain. You're continually being refreshed. You're continually being quenched of your thirst. And this doesn't mean that a Christian, the normal Christian life is to not have any thirst for God. Obviously, a Christian does have thirst for God. Even though we drink of the living water, we still thirst for God. But what this means is the kind of thirst for what this woman was lacking, and what she needed was, she needed to connect with God, and she was lacking that. That lack will be permanently resolved if you drink and continue to drink from the water that I will give. And so, when he told her about her marital past, she said, "Oh, sir, I perceive you're a prophet." And therefore, she thought, now there's someone who can answer this question. I've heard the rabbis debating this all my life. Our Samaritan rabbis insist and have proof that Mount Gerizim is the holy place. The Jewish rabbis, they insist that Jerusalem is. I have no confidence that any sacrifice I offer in either place would be acceptable, because I don't know if it would be the right place. But now there's someone here for the first time who can quench this thirst for understanding of how I can atone for my sins, how I can get right with God again. My life has become a disaster. It's become a mess. It's just, behind me there's a trail of broken relationships. I just feel like I need somehow to get connected with God again, but I don't know where to find Him, because there's different denominations saying different things. And so Jesus answers her when she asks about where the right place to worship is, and worship means offer sacrifices, so that's what she wanted to do. Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship," meaning you Samaritans worship, "what you do not know. We, the Jews, know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. And the woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he'll tell us all things. And Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. Now, Jesus is saying, you know, you're worried about something that's not even, you don't have to worry about. Doesn't matter where you offer a sacrifice. Is it Gerizim? Is it Jerusalem? God is no longer concerned about Gerizim or Jerusalem. The hour is coming soon when no one's going to be worshiping in Jerusalem or in Gerizim anymore. You know why? Because Jesus foresaw within the lifetime of many of those people, the Romans are going to come, they're going to destroy both those shrines. And both those shrines are going to be missing for thousands of years. The temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, so was the shrine in Gerizim. The Romans wiped it out. That was 40 years after this conversation. And people from that time on did not worship in Mount Gerizim or Jerusalem. And so he's saying, first of all, you're worried about something that's an obsolete concern. The hour is coming when you'll neither worship in Jerusalem or in this mountain. No one's going to be worshiping here anymore. These shrines will be gone. But God has something else to replace it, something he cares more about. He's looking for people who worship in spirit. Not in this location or in that location, but in spirit and in truth. Now, in truth means honestly. That's the expression in truth in Scripture means genuinely, as opposed to hypocritically. One of the most common things in religion in any time, and certainly in those days, was the Pharisaic hypocrisy that, pretended to be more righteous than one was. The idea of trying to get a reputation for oneself of being holy, holier than other people, when you're really not. And worshiping like the Pharisees who'd blow a trumpet before them before they gave a coin to a beggar. Or making long prayers on a street corner so everyone could see how spiritual they were. Jesus said, when you do those things, when you worship like that, don't be like the hypocrites. Don't be like that. When you pray, when you give, when you do any act of piety, make sure that sacrifice you're making is a sacrifice of worship in truth. That is a genuine act, not a hypocritical one. God is looking for and having a hard time finding those who worship him genuinely. And the other part is in spirit and in truth. In spirit means internally as opposed to externally. The religion of the time was primarily understood to be that of keeping outward rituals. Don't touch this, don't eat that, offer this sacrifice, make this journey at this time of the year. Those are all external things. That's not the worship God's looking for. God's looking for worship that's inside the heart, in the spirit of man. Now, he might mean in the Holy Spirit, and that would be fine too. But the point is, it's internal. Whether he's talking about the Holy Spirit or the human spirit, the idea is that it's not external and ritualistic behavior. He's looking for something that's inside the heart. We know that Jesus said that. Jesus said, this is how people know you're my disciples, if you have love for one another. And what is love but the fruit of the Spirit? It's an internally generated phenomenon when you have the Spirit of God and when you are worshiping God spiritually as opposed to in an externalistic, ritualistic way. So Jesus is saying, there's a lot of people worshiping the Father in Gerizim and Jerusalem right now. Most of it is not in spirit and most of it's not in truth. And God's looking for people who do that. And if he's having a hard time finding someone who worships in spirit and truth, it must be that almost everyone else is worshiping some other way than that. The fact that God is seeking such to worship him should be taken it to the Christian as a summons, God is looking for something. Let it be me. Lord, here am I, send me. When he said to Isaiah, who will go for us? Isaiah, here am I, send me. When he says, I'm looking for worshipers in spirit and truth. Here am I, send me. Please, let me be a worshiper in spirit and truth, if that's what you're looking for. Especially if they're rare enough that you're having a hard time finding them. Let me make them one person less rare than they were before and become one. Let me become a true worshiper. A spiritual worshiper. Not a person who just tacks on religious rituals to a carnal life and a selfish life, but periodically goes to church and does the spiritual ritual of singing the songs, lifting the hands, giving the tithe, sitting for the sermon. This is all ritualistic. I mean, it can be genuine. You can do all those things in a heartfelt way, but all those things be done without any heart at all, without any sincerity at all, without any internal agreement with it at all. What God is looking at is what's on the heart. And that's what Jesus says. You're so concerned about whether you're in the right spot offering your sacrifice. Well, the sacrifice you're going to offer is going to be a spiritual sacrifice. Because you're going to worship in spirit and in truth. You're not going to be needing to continue this ritualistic worship of Gerizim or Jerusalem in the future. It's over. And she says, well, okay, that sounds pretty radical, but I know if the Messiah comes and confirms that, I'll know it's true, because he's going to come and tell us everything. He said, well, I am him, so you might as well listen to me now. And she took it seriously. She actually figured he just might be. And she went to tell her friends. But we're going to have to stop there tonight.